And now I need to start putting things back together, and I've had a look at the balls I removed and they are, as far as I can tell, perfect, and the headstock felt nice and smooth before I stripped it anyway. And I'm going to put it back together with some of this Lanagard stuff. Although it's you know, I've touted it as an anti-rust treatment, it is actually suitable as a lubricant, and particularly at the low temperatures out here today, it's really nice and sticky, which is going to come in handy. And I've got to load this race up with a layer of grease and then stick the balls in it. In fact, what I'm going to do is I'm going to take a glove off, because I actually want to smear it on all the surfaces, and that's going to be easiest with a finger. So there'll be the grooves will be fully loaded up for lubricant, and the rest of the surfaces will just get a smear for corrosion protection. In fact, I think I might try filling the groove this way as well. Yeah, it works well. Now this is where the extreme stickiness of the grease comes in handy, because you need to load the cone with a full complement of balls and they need to stay there. When you filled the race, you should almost think that you can get one more ball in. I haven't pushed them up particularly tight, but there's nearly room for one more ball, and that's the correct amount of fill in a loose ball race like this. One more ball and all the balls wouldn't have space to separate and they'd rub on each other. So that's now ready to go and install on the bike. We've got to do a similar thing here, except we're working in the cup rather than on the cone. That's plenty in there. And then we'll just load it up with the balls. Preferably not dropping any, like that. And having retrieved it, the last one. And I've got the top cone, and I'm just going to give that a light smear for corrosion protection, but not try and actually load it up with grease as such. I'll also take a fingertip of grease and wipe it into the bottom cup. That's done, and we're all ready to start going back together. So we'll carefully insert the steering stem up through the bottom. And install the top bearing cone. I can slip the top yoke on, and there's just enough thread protruding to get the nut started, which will then allow me to pull that top bearing cone on. Right, we're nearly there. We've got a little bit of play in it. So I'll take the nut back off. And the top yoke. Because this was a light press fit or transition fit, it'll stay in place. And we can put on the dust cap. I just leave that out initially because it can kind of get in your way. I want to get that centered up. And the washer. And then particularly if you've had the bearing cones actually removed for any reason, it's you often have to torque the bearings down quite a long way to seat the cones. You don't want to do that too much with a ball bearing race because you can dent the races with the balls. Now, I'm going to leave this fairly slack at the moment because that makes everything easier. I need to be able to move everything about to get the stanchions back in, and then you want no perceptible rock, and you don't want any drag from the bearings. You don't want to feel the balls running over any imperfections. Is the correct tension, but you definitely don't want any play in there apart from it failing the MOT. It can create any slack will tend to actually hammer the bearings. You can even get fork judder and potentially bar wobble, or a full-on tank slapper can result sometimes from slack in the head bearings. Marinis are pretty forgiving, and it's unlikely to do so even with a considerable amount of play, but it should still be adjusted correctly anyway. Now, while the tank's off, I'm going to take the carburetors off and give them an overhaul, and I'll do the valve clearances as well, while it's very easy to do so. So I've got a pipe clip on the intake rubber, and there's a clamp onto the inlet manifold, and then the carburetor should now swivel, and these intake rubbers are a push fit into the air cleaner, and it being cold out here, they're rather stiff. Isn't ideal. So in fact what I won't do is I won't take that off the carburetor. I'll just take the carburetor off intact, and once you've got the thing slackened off, you can lean the carb over and there's a balance fuel pipe between the two carburetors, and I don't know if I can get an angle on it, but there's a banjo on the side of the carbs, and the easiest way is to take that off with a 10mm screw. There we go. So now I should be able to now if these throttle cables are disconnected, but if you were just doing the carbs without doing the other end, you do the two screws on the top, and normally these come free straight away, but this hasn't been touched in a while, so the gasket's stuck. These are captive screws, so you need to undo them fairly evenly. Like so. They will, so I can't push it through, but it would then if I continued moving it unscrew from the cover. So you lift the slide out, and you'll note that the top of the slide is angled, and that's to push the slide in this direction to compensate for it being a square slide. You can see there the wear on the slide, and you just need to unhook the spring, and then there's a little keyhole for the cable, and the spring retains the cable. So I can slide the cable out, and we'll put the slide back in for safekeeping. Take two, we'll put the slide back in for safekeeping, and then I'll just work the carb off the inlet manifold. It's quite stiff, but it is coming. The rubber inlet manifolds are an awful lot easier I think I might even resort to a little bit of leverage. That's better. That's one carburetor off, and the early carbs are VHBs and the latest are VHBZ, and it's the different style of clamping arrangement that these have got a nylon sleeve in there, and this is split like a collet with a clamp, and the later carbs have got a spigot that goes into the rubber inlet manifold. And this is an inlet rubber for the 250 single, but that's the side that would go to the carburetor, and that's the side that would go to the head, and there'd be a stub that screws into the head rather than this metal manifold. So I can repeat this on the other side, and then the two carburetors can go onto the bench ready to be stripped and put through the cleaning tank. Well, I finally got both carburetors off. The second one was really stubborn. I had to take the airbox out of the way, which is just held in place with a pair of bolts. The original screws have been replaced, and I had these really serious hand rippers sticking out the back. Now that the carbs are off, I'm going to protect the intake stubs, so I've just got a bit of gaffer tape, and we'll block those off, keep any dirt and dust out. And the next job I'm going to do is I'm going to do the carburetor rebuild. Well, this is the right hand or rear cylinder carburetor, and I didn't drain these first before I took them out, so take them off. So it's leaking fuel out. And the first thing I'm going to do, well, I'll just show you the banjo assembly I took off earlier. This is all the fuel pipes and the two banjos, and just behind the banjo is the fuel strainer. And it's always worth, particularly if you've recently recommissioned a bike and the tank might have been you know, a bit of debris in there, or you've had it treated or whatever, you get stuff accumulating in these strainers, and they're easy to pull out. There's a little recess for you to get a screwdriver into and just ease it off that centre spigot, of course being incredibly careful not to puncture it. I'll just pop out like that. So first of all I'm going to remove the float bowl. That's a 14mm nut. Well, the slide course falls out. They shouldn't be particularly tight. It is possible to strip the thread in here, but that is your float bowl nut and the main jet holder, and there's the main jet. I'm just having a quick look at the size, and that's a 112, which is stock. And now off comes the float bowl, and have a look at the residue in there. That's old fuel reacting, and there's an O-ring seal that you, generally speaking, hope very much stays in the float bowl. When these are supplied, they are a round O-ring, and getting one to actually go in the float bowl and stay there is not easy. So you don't change them unless you really have to. So we have the idle jet or pilot jet, the starting jet and emulsion tube, which is a one-piece assembly. Down in the main jet holder is the atomizer or emulsion tube, or direct translation, a pulverizer. And this is because they've got the float assembly and the float pivot pin. So the first thing I'm going to do is take out the float pivot pin. And this has got a sort of spline on one end, and sometimes they are quite tight in the carb body. If you grab it with a fairly wide set of pliers, and then you can lever down, so that's the float out, and on the back of the float is the float needle, which has got a rubber tip. And often these are worth changing for modern fuel. I've had old ones work perfectly well on modern fuel, and I've had other ones that just don't want to seal until you change them. And this style of carburetor, the older one, the float needle seat is pressed in rather than screwed into the carburetor body. I find a little chubby flat blade works for getting the jets out pretty well. So that's your starter jet with its little air admittance holes along the side, and the actual jet itself on the end. There's an O-ring on this which matches that hole down the base of the float bowl there, and some people insist that that O-ring has to be intact or they're very difficult to start. I found no difference whatsoever, and as far as I'm concerned it just holds the float bowl on whilst you're fitting the main jet nut. So we'll have the idle jet. Again, that's a stock 50 size. I frequently find you need to go smaller on modern fuels. They run too rich through progression, and you get a bit of a fluffing or stumble when pulling away. And now there's the atomizer. Now if you are ever doing this in situ on the bike, which I often find handy, you need to get someone to operate the throttle or pull the cables and put a peg on them, because otherwise you can damage the tip of the metering needle. And there we go, that's the atomizer, and this the pattern and position of holes in the side do various things. One's at the bottom, let fuel in. One's at the top, this is the top, let air in, and so it's sort of transient enrichment or leaning at various stages during the throttle progression. And let's see, this is a 260k, which is the leanest running of all the jets, and we'll see when I've got the bike back together whether we need to go up to the next richer. Fortunately, the hole pattern in the K can be extended to turn it into the next one, and in fact the one above that, which often the Sport needs. I'll leave the clamp on for the moment. I'll get the carb clean, a bit cleaner before I try and take that off. The little intake trumpet there unscrews, but I tend to leave them in place. This is the starting lever, or choke, which rather than a choke, which chokes off part of the airflow, hence the name. They're sometimes even called a strangler flap. This opens a little sort of auxiliary carburetor metered by the starting jet, opens up an extra air passage for starting, and this is the O-ring which does affect starting once I've got this out. It's nice to work on this carburetor because nothing's been over tightened. You frequently find carburetors where the jets have been put in by a gorilla or something, and almost impossibly tight. I usually find I have to put the carburetor body in hot water then to expand it and just break the seal. Okay, so that, give that a little wiggle, and hopefully, yeah, that'll come out, and you can see the little O-ring there. Nearly there. This is your idle mixture screw. And behind it there is a spring. And in theory there's an O-ring, but I usually find there isn't. And there's two styles of these needles, and one's got a short end on it and one's got a longer end on it, and it can be worth converting to the later longer style, which are a little less fiddly to adjust. And then the last thing to go is the idle stop screw. And again, in theory there's an O-ring. There'll be one supplied in the rebuild kit, but often they're a complete pain if you actually try using one, and I usually find there isn't one. And that's one, apart from the clamp here and the plastic bits, which I don't generally remove. one carb body, all ready to go in the cleaning tank. And overall it looks in pretty good condition. There's this little bit of crystallized fuel or what have you up here, but I've seen these really quite seriously powdered and corroded inside, but I think we're going to have no trouble with that at all.